June light spills across my kitchen floor when the phone rings on a Saturday in Lincoln, Nebraska, and I feel the answer before I pick up. Steam rises from a fresh pot of coffee, and a hopeful list sits on the counter as if plans could hold. I answer anyway. It is Evelyn. We are flying to Hawaii tomorrow. You will stay with Callie. No, please. No, thank you. Only a verdict spoken like weather. Evan takes the phone and says she cannot move anyway, you just have to be there. His tone is smooth and distant like a hall you walk even when you do not want to reach the door at the end. I set the mug down and watch the surface settle. I think about every favor that became a duty and how duty turns into a chain when no one names it. My neighbor lifts a hand over the fence and calls out with a wry smile that I am doing round the clock, care for free, that is not family, that is unpaid labor. I smile because she is right, and because I know I will still say yes. 15 minutes later, Evelyn drops a key into my palm and says, if anything happens to her, it is on you. She does not step inside. She inspects my living room with the brisk gaze of a manager and turns away already halfway to a beach. I study our wedding photo on the shelf. The glass is clean. The frame is straight. I whisper what I will not say aloud. I guess I am the family discount nurse again. I drive to their house with an overnight bag and a larger sense of surrender. The Whitman place sits under cottonwoods on a careful street. Inside, it smells like citrus cleaner over metal, a hotel shine with a hospital note. Callie lies in a back bedroom with the curtains closed. She is 24 pale and still hands folded like paper. I greet her and tell her I will be here all week. Her eyes meet mine with a steady light that says she is present even when others speak over her. I learn the routine within an hour: fresh water, soft music, notes for requests. The fridge holds champagne and little else. On a sticky note, I write milk eggs fruit and press it to the door like a small protest sign. When I return, I hear a faint sound that could be a laugh. Callie lifts one finger to her lips. The meaning is clear. Do not trust the script they hand you. The words land and ripple. I pull a chair close and promise that I will not leave and that I can learn. I doze in the armchair and wake near midnight to the house, breathing its mechanical breath, the hum of vents, and the patient tick of a thermostat. I think about how Evan said you just have to be there, and how being there is always the whole job and the bill, too. Morning arrives with a white sky and a lawn sprinkler that clicks like a metronome. I make oatmeal and brew coffee from a tin that sits in a perfect cabinet no one uses. Evelyn sends a text that says, remember that Callie needs quiet and do not upset her with questions. I set the phone face down and listen to the silence as if it holds instructions. By noon, the house has settled into careful calm. Somewhere a television whispers. A hall clock measures tiny steps. I sit beside Callie and read from a paperback about a woman who leaves a life that looks fine from the curb. Callie blinks and a shadow of a smile appears. I ask if she would like water. Her fingers move a fraction and I take it as yes. I start to map the rhythms of this place the way you learn a new song. I notice what they keep and what they forget. Designer bags in a closet and dust in a pantry, a wine fridge and no bread. In a drawer, I find a laminated chart of letters and gestures. I practice until my hands feel clumsy and earnest. In the late afternoon, the neighbor knocks and leaves a casserole because that is what decent people do when they hear about illness. She peers past me into the grand hallway and whispers that there are no photos of Callie on the walls, only trips and trophies. The sun lowers and sends gold through the blinds. I smooth the blanket and tell Callie about a borrower who brought cookies to thank me for explaining a loan without talking down to him. Being clear is a kind of respect, I say, and I want to offer you the same. I ask if she would like music. Her lashes lift once in a slow yes. I play a piano piece at low volume and the room eases. At dinner, I heat soup and sit by the window with a view of even lawns and a quiet street. I picture the family laughing over a resort meal under a postcard sky. I picture the bill paid with a card that belongs to someone who was not invited. The thought crawls under my skin and stays. Night settles. I check the locks and wash one mug. I stand in the doorway and listen to the steady rhythm of her breath. "Thank you for trusting me with your quiet," I say. "I am here and I am not afraid of work. I have done hard work my whole life." I turn to leave when I hear a whisper that is hardly sound, yet clear as a bell at dawn. "Stay." I freeze. My heart rises into my throat. I turn back. Her eyes are open and bright. The room narrows to the space between us. The clock ticks. The air holds its breath. "Stay," she says again, stronger now. "Please." I pull the chair close and take her hand, because there's nothing else to do, and because everything has just changed. The story I was given cracks like thin ice, and I see dark water under it, cold and deep and real. I do not know what waits there. I only know I am done pretending that silence is the same as peace. Would you stay or walk away from this toxic family? The Whitman house looked polished but cold, the kind of quiet that smelled like lemon cleaner and distance. 3 days had passed since Evelyn handed me the keys, and I was still trying to convince myself that this was temporary, that helping family meant something. The morning light slid across the marble floor as I carried a tray of soup into Callie's room. She lay still under a pale blanket, her eyes following the spoon as I stirred it once, before setting it on the nightstand. She tried to smile, but the expression faded as if it had nowhere to rest. Her voice had been gone since childhood, or so they said. I spoke anyway because silence made the air heavier. I told her the soup smelled good and that I found a playlist of old jazz she might like. She blinked twice. I took that as yes. Later, I opened the fridge, searching for milk, maybe fruit, anything to make a breakfast that felt human. The shelves were lined with bottles of champagne, 3 types of sparkling water, and a drawer of imported cheese no one had touched. No milk, no eggs, nothing soft or practical. The contrast felt like a punch. I closed the door and looked at my reflection in the stainless steel. My hair was coming loose, my eyes looked older. I pulled out my small notebook, the one I used for budgeting when I still worked at the bank, and flipped to a page labeled Personal Loans. I wrote another line under Evelyn's name. Loan to Evelyn, $47,000, never repaid. I could still see her signature on the old check and the way she promised to return it after Evan's business expansion. The expansion turned out to be a diamond ring and a new patio. I had learned to swallow resentment the way people take daily vitamins. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table while the television hummed in another room. News headlines about inflation and layoffs drifted through the walls, numbers that seemed to belong to someone else's story. I checked on Callie again. She was awake, her gaze calm but alert. I adjusted her pillow and asked if she was comfortable. She moved her fingers slightly, tracing a small pattern in the air. I did not recognize it. I asked if she wanted to write something down, but she just pointed to the family photo on the dresser. I followed her eyes. Evan and his mother stood in the center, smiling too wide. Callie sat in the corner of the frame, her body angled away, the light missing her face. It struck me as deliberate. That night, I heard something faint, almost like a laugh. It came from the hallway. When I opened the door, Callie's eyes were open. She lifted a hand, her index finger pressed to her lips in the universal sign for quiet. A chill moved through me, even though the room was warm. Her expression was neither afraid nor playful, but something in between, like a warning wrapped in calm. I whispered, "Did you hear something?" She shook her head slowly, then pointed toward the door and mouthed a single word that I read as listen. I stood there waiting, but the only sound was the refrigerator clicking to a stop in the kitchen. When I turned back, Callie had closed her eyes again. I sat in the chair beside her bed for a long time, watching the small rise and fall of her chest, thinking about how silence in this house felt more strategic than medical. The next afternoon, Evelyn called to check in. Her tone was sharp, efficient, the voice of a woman who managed people like ledgers. She asked if Callie had eaten, if the sheets were clean, if I remembered to keep the curtains drawn. Then she added, "Do not talk too much to her, she gets confused easily." I said, of course, and hung up, but the words stayed like grit between teeth. "Confused easily," I repeated under my breath. "Or not confused at all." Later, I cleaned the pantry and found an envelope labeled "Receipts" with nothing inside. The air conditioner buzzed on cool and mechanical. I sat at the table and tried to make sense of the patterns forming around me. Everything here felt too precise, too staged, like a set, built to keep one person quiet while others lived off the silence. At dusk, I brought Callie a cup of tea. She wrote something on a notepad with slow effort. The letters leaned to the right, uneven but clear. "Do not believe everything they say." My stomach tightened. I asked what she meant. She glanced toward the doorway, then at the photograph again, and closed the notebook. The words stayed visible long enough to press into memory. I nodded as if I understood, though I did not. That night I could not sleep. The television downstairs was off, the windows drawn. I heard the faint creak of the floor as the wind moved through the house. I stood by the doorway watching the curtains lift and settle. Somewhere inside, something was off rhythm. I thought about the 47,000, about Evelyn's smooth voice saying, "Family always helps family," about how she smiled as if that made it true. I thought about Callie's warning and the look in her eyes that did not belong to someone trapped. It belonged to someone waiting. When I finally closed my eyes, I dreamed of paper stacked in neat rows, every bill stamped paid in red except one. I woke to the same lemon scent and the same cold light pouring through the blinds. Callie was watching me from her pillow, a small smile forming again. I smiled back and whispered good morning. The room felt heavier, as if the walls knew I had seen too much. Outside, a lawn service trimmed the hedges to perfect angles. Inside, the air barely moved. By the end of the day, I had cleaned every counter and folded every blanket, yet unease sat in the corners like dust. That night, as the wind pushed against the windows, I sat by her bedside and wondered how many lies could fit inside a family before it cracked. The clock ticked steady and the house stayed quiet, too quiet, like something was waiting to be spoken, but not by me. I leaned back, eyes half closed, and listened to the rhythm of her breathing. Somewhere deep down, I felt it again, that weight of a secret pressing to surface, the kind that changes everything once it breaks the air. The next Tuesday morning began like every other one that week, sunlight spilling across the polished hallway and the smell of toast faintly filling the air. I carried the breakfast tray into Callie's room with the quiet rhythm of someone who had repeated this act too many times. Bread milk and orange sliced neatly. She was already awake, her head tilted toward the window. When I set the tray down, she moved her legs under the blanket. I froze, unsure of what I had just seen. Then slowly, she pushed herself upright. My breath caught in my throat as she stood, her bare feet pressing against the wooden floor. The tray rattled in my hands, and the spoon clattered onto the saucer. Steam from the milk rose between us like mist in a dream. Callie looked straight at me, her eyes sharp, her voice rough but certain. "They stole my trust, my $3 million. For a second, I thought I imagined it. The words hung in the air, alive, undeniable. I sat down so fast the chair legs screeched against the tile. "You can talk." My voice came out like a whisper. She nodded once. I wasn't mute, Lydia. I was silenced. I felt the room tilt, my mind racing through every story Evelyn had ever told, every pitying sigh at family dinners, every instruction to keep curtains closed. Callie stepped toward her desk and opened a laptop, its screen flickering from sleep to life. She clicked on a banking tab and turned it toward me. The screen showed a series of transfers labeled Whitman Holdings, LLC, $2,500 every month, perfectly timed, perfectly clean. My eyes followed the pattern, every payment stretching back to the month her father died. "So they forged your trust fund and pocketed the interest I asked." "Every month," she said quietly, "since Dad died." Her voice cracked on the word Dad, but she steadied herself. I leaned forward, reading the memo lines, the fake account identifiers. The precision made my stomach twist. Years of deception dressed as caretaking. I muttered, and here I am folding their laundry. Guess I married the wrong career criminal. For a heartbeat, the tension broke. Callie laughed. It startled both of us. The sound was small and hoarse, but real, the first I had ever heard from her. Her laugh faded into a quiet sigh, the kind that came from remembering how long you had stayed quiet just to survive. I reached out and took the laptop, scrolling through the transactions again. It was all there, hidden in plain sight. I could almost hear Evelyn's clipped tone echoing, "Money is complicated, dear. Let the men handle it." I wanted to throw something, but instead I took a slow breath. Callie watched me waiting. "You believed them all these years," I said. "They told everyone I was too fragile, too unstable for responsibility. It kept them in control." Her words were sharp and exact, as if rehearsed in her head for years. She pointed to a folder on the desktop labeled "Legal." Inside were scanned copies of documents, each one signed by Evelyn and Evan as guardians. My name appeared once as witness from a signature night I barely remembered. She'd handed me a form and said, "Sign this for the clinic Lydia were updating Callie's insurance." The realization hit like cold water. I had helped seal Callie's silence. I looked at her guilt rising. She shook her head gently as if reading my thoughts. "You didn't know," she said. "That's what they count on, people not knowing." I felt something old and raw stir inside me, a kind of anger that came with clarity. I asked if she had told anyone else. "No one listens to the patient," she said with a sad half-smile. "They only listen to the ones holding the checkbook." I sat back, the morning sun shifting across her desk. Outside, a lawnmower hummed distantly, the world moving on like nothing had changed. But everything had. I could see it in her stance, the way she held herself, no longer fragile but measured, steady, determined. "You're not staying silent anymore, are you?" I said. She met my eyes. "Not if you help me." The request was simple, but heavy. Help her meant standing against my husband, his mother, the people who had turned family into an income stream. I thought of all the unpaid debts, not just money, but dignity, years of being the dependable one, the polite one, the woman who fixed everything quietly. The words Callie had written days ago echoed back. "Do not believe everything they say." I had not understood then, but now it made perfect sense. Evelyn's control wasn't just financial, it was narrative. She owned the story everyone else told. I closed the laptop carefully and said, "Show me everything." Callie smiled faintly, relief and fear mixing in her eyes. She handed me a small flash drive wrapped in tissue paper. "I kept copies," she whispered. "Just in case." My mind began to move faster, lining up possibilities, potential risks. If they were siphoning money, there would be records, maybe medical fraud, maybe forged authorizations. The banker in me woke up cold and methodical. I asked if her father had left any notes or letters. She said there had been one, a handwritten letter, but Evelyn kept it locked in the office safe. I made a mental note of its location, the second drawer below the window. My pulse steadied as the fog lifted. This wasn't just care work anymore. It was evidence gathering. I felt something close to purpose for the first time in months. Later that afternoon, I made tea and we sat by the window. The rhythm of ordinary domestic life returned just enough to disguise the storm building under it. Callie rested her chin on her hands, watching the steam curl from her cup. She said softly, "They always said, 'Family looks after you.'" I replied they forgot to mention the fine print. She smiled, tired but alive. Outside, the light began to fade, orange edges softening into gray. I realized that beneath the weight of lies, there was a map forming a way through this maze. I did not yet know where it ended, but I knew the first step. I would stop believing in their version of kindness. That night, I sat alone by the window, coffee cooling beside me, streetlights reflecting in the glass. My reflection looked steadier than I felt, but the decision was already written inside me. I had stumbled into something bigger than deceit, a structure built on greed disguised as duty. The Whitman family didn't just take Callie's money, they rewrote her existence. And now sitting in that cold kitchen with her secret burning in my mind, I understood what kind of story I had married into. It was not about love or loyalty. It was about ownership. and for the first time I was ready to question who really belonged in this house. 2 days later, I sat at the kitchen table with Callie's flash drive in my pocket and the morning sun cutting clean through the curtains. The house smelled faintly of polish and reheated soup. I had already decided what to do next. I called an old friend, Eleanor Briggs, a financial lawyer I used to work with back when I still believed diligence alone could fix corruption. Her voice sounded the same as ever, brisk and calm. Lydia Hartman. I have not heard that name since you saved that credit union from a bad audit. What trouble are you in now? I hesitated before saying, not me, someone else. She told me to email the documents and said she would look into the legality of a trust transfer between family members under guardianship. Her tone softened. I'll call you back by Thursday, she said. You sound like someone who found a bomb under the living room rug. After I hung up, I turned to the cabinets Evelyn kept locked. The keys hung on a hook disguised as a piece of decor, a golden pair with a hidden hinge. I took it down and opened the small filing cabinet near the study. Most folders were labeled with neutral titles, utilities, taxes, home insurance. But near the back, I found one thicker marked Medical Report 2021. I opened it expecting appointment summaries. Instead, the first page stopped me cold. Patient capable of speech, therapy discontinued by guardian. My breath caught. I read the line again, capable of speech, discontinued by guardian. Beneath it were payment records showing disability benefits of $4,800 a month deposited into an account under Whitman Holdings, each payment authorized by Evelyn as legal guardian. I felt the room tilt. My hands shook as I turned the page. The notes were clear, clinical, dated, undeniable. A doctor had recommended continued therapy. Evelyn had signed off on termination instead, citing emotional strain and family preference. It was not neglect, it was strategy. Callie had been silenced for profit. I walked to her room, still holding the report. She was sitting up, reading on her tablet, her hair tied back loosely. I handed her the paper. She read slowly, her lips moving without sound. When she reached the line about therapy, her eyes filled with tears. They said therapy was making me worse, she whispered. I crouched beside her bed, my own anger a pulse behind my ribs. No, it was making you independent. The words came out low and sharp, the truth heavy as iron. She pressed her hands to her face and shook her head, crying quietly. I sat beside her silent until her breathing steadied. When she lowered her hands, she looked different, calmer, but older. I took the report back and placed it in my notebook. I told her she would not lose her voice again, not while I was here. That afternoon, I brewed coffee strong enough to feel like resolve and opened my old laptop. Years in banking had taught me how paper trails betray themselves when you know where to look. I found the state's Medical Fraud Bureau portal. There was an option to report anonymously. I scanned the doctor's note, the guardianship document, the bank statements. I filled out the fields one by one, each word a small act of justice. Under summary of fraud, I wrote, Guardian discontinued therapy despite medical clearance to maintain financial benefits. I attached files, checked for accuracy twice, and clicked submit. The confirmation page appeared pale blue, sterile, final. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled. The house felt different already, as if the walls themselves had shifted to listen. I printed a hard copy of the report and slid it into an envelope addressed to the Bureau, adding no name, no return address. When I stepped outside, the air was crisp and clean. The street was quiet, only the distant buzz of a mower breaking the stillness. I walked to the mailbox at the corner, the envelope warm in my hand. For a moment, I imagined Evelyn's expression when her careful empire started to crack. Then I smiled faintly and dropped the envelope in. Mini revenge number 1, I said under my breath, and the sound of the lid closing felt like punctuation. Back inside, I brewed another cup of coffee and sat by the window. Callie was in the living room sketching something with deliberate strokes. Her voice was still quiet, but she hummed under her breath, a small melody that sounded like defiance. I watched her draw and thought of the long road ahead, the legal steps, the paperwork, the resistance. but for the first time it felt like momentum instead of despair. That evening, the sky turned the color of burnished copper, the kind that makes you believe the world still has balance somewhere. I cleaned the kitchen and caught my reflection in the darkened glass. I looked steadier. The notebook sat open on the counter with new entries. I added one more line. Report filed. Awaiting result. At dinner, I tried to keep the conversation light. Callie told me she once wanted to be a data analyst because numbers made sense when people did not. I told her numbers had always been my shield, too. She smiled, a real one this time, small but certain. We ate quietly while the television murmured about the stock market. The irony was not lost on me. Families like this one built empires from deceit and called it stability. By 9, the house was silent again. I walked to the mailbox to check the evening delivery out of habit. Bills, advertisements, a folded magazine. Nothing unusual. But as I turned back toward the porch, I looked at the empty space inside the box where my letter had been. It felt symbolic, a small subtraction from their comfort, a seed of consequence planted. I went to bed lighter than before. The next morning, the routine returned, ordinary as ever. Coffee, medication, laundry, yet underneath a hum of anticipation, justice has a slow heartbeat, but it was alive now, pulsing through the quiet halls. 3 days later, while wiping the counter, I saw the mailman leave a stack of envelopes at the door. Among them was one marked "Confidential," printed in bold black letters, addressed to Whitman household. My pulse quickened. I left it on the table untouched. The sound of the wind through the blinds filled the silence. Somewhere behind me, Callie's sketchbook fell to the floor, open to a page covered in lines and figures that looked like wings. A week later, the house no longer felt like a prison, but a quiet operations base. Callie and I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by papers, empty coffee mugs, and a half-eaten box of cold pizza. The morning light fell across the mess like a spotlight on a crime scene. We had started calling it Operation Karma. It sounded half joking, half sacred. I wrote the title at the top of my notebook in red pen, underlining it twice. Step 1, I said, find the original trust deed. Without it, they can claim everything was verbal. Step 2, set up the camera to record their own words. Step 3, the public reveal at the welcome home dinner. Callie nodded between bites of pizza, her focus sharp. She'd grown stronger these past few days, moving around the house without fear, sometimes even humming as she worked. It was a small revolution in motion. We made lists, circled tasks, laughed at our own nervousness. There was something absurdly human about planning justice over a cold lunch. At one point, she leaned back and asked what happens if they find out first. Then we improvise, I said. My tone was calm, but my pulse said otherwise. While she typed notes on her tablet, I checked my bank app for no reason other than habit. That was when I saw it. A pending charge from Pacific Travel Group for 2 first-class tickets to Hawaii booked under my credit card. The amount made me sit up straight. I stared at the screen, remembering the way Evelyn had handed me my wallet last week, claiming she needed to take my car for detailing. She must have taken the card out then and used it. I showed Callie the charge. Her mouth fell open. She actually used your card for her vacation. I smiled without humor. Fraudulent transaction, I said softly. Then I called the airline. The customer service agent was polite but cautious. I explained that my card had been used without permission for a trip booked under Evelyn Whitman. There was a pause, a few keyboard clicks, then confirmation. The tickets were canceled and flagged for review, refund pending. I thanked the agent and hung up, feeling an unfamiliar thrill. Mini revenge number 2 accomplished. When they tried to board that plane, I told Callie, let's see if karma has good timing. She laughed so hard she nearly dropped her tablet. For the first time, the air between us felt lighter, almost joyful. After she went to rest, I cleaned the living room to keep my hands busy. While dusting the framed photos on the mantel, I noticed something strange. A faint red glimmer blinked from behind one of the frames. I leaned closer and saw it again, a tiny LED light, steady and deliberate. My stomach tightened. It was a camera, small and nearly invisible, pointed straight at Callie's bed. I followed the wire behind the photo and found it led to a hidden receiver disguised as a decorative box. Evelyn had been watching her. I stood there for a long second, fury turning cold and precise. "You spy on your own niece, Evelyn," I whispered. "Let's make you watch your own downfall." I unplugged the receiver, examined the device, then plugged it back in, but shifted the frame. Now the lens faced the kitchen table, where our evidence pile sat. The trust statements, the medical report, the transaction screenshots, everything laid out under perfect light. I wanted Evelyn to see exactly how her empire was unraveling, detail by detail. I sat on the couch and waited for the guilt to arrive. It did not. Instead, I felt steady. Every woman who had been underestimated knows this calm before justice. Later, Callie joined me and I showed her the tiny camera. Her face darkened. "So she watched me sleep." "Probably watched you too," I said. She took a slow breath, then whispered, "Let her watch." The defiance in her tone made me proud. We marked a red dot on our plan labeled Camera Counterattack. The rest of the day passed quietly. I organized files while Callie printed photos of transactions to create a physical trail. The sound of the printer filled the silence with purpose. When evening came, we ate leftovers at the counter. She asked what we would do if Evelyn confronted us before the dinner. "Tell the truth," I said. "Liars hate that the most." She smiled faintly. After she went to bed, I sat alone with a cup of coffee, watching the hallway light flicker. The refrigerator hummed behind me, steady and mechanical. Every sound felt amplified, like the house was breathing. I wrote another line in my notebook: "Evidence recorded, awaiting return." The sense of countdown had begun. That night, I lay in bed, but could not rest. The clock read 1:17, then 2:04. The refrigerator clicked on again, a rhythmic pulse in the quiet. The sound reminded me of a ticking clock, each hum marking the seconds before their return. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows, carrying the faint scent of rain. I thought about Evelyn in Hawaii, believing she had escaped consequence, unaware that her own camera had turned into her undoing. I thought about Evan, always pretending to be busy with work while letting his mother handle the dirty details. And I thought about Callie asleep upstairs, free for the first time from the constant invisible gaze. I promised myself I would not let that light return to her room ever again. Near dawn, exhaustion finally caught up with me. I closed my eyes and dreamed of a courtroom where the walls themselves spoke, where every secret recorded its own confession. When I woke a few hours later, the first sound I heard was the low hum of the refrigerator again. It no longer felt like background noise. It felt like a countdown, steady and certain, ticking toward the day truth would walk through the front door. 3 weeks later, the Whitman SUV rolled into the driveway, tires crunching over gravel that had not been swept since they left. The afternoon light was sharp and merciless, washing the car in glare. I watched from the kitchen window as Evelyn stepped out first, her hat crooked, her expression like a storm about to land. Evan followed, dragging suitcases with the exaggerated fatigue of a man used to being served. They were 6 hours late, and I already knew why. At the airport, the flagged tickets had turned their return into a public inconvenience. Evelyn slammed the trunk shut and shouted toward the house, "Someone tampered with our tickets. Do you know anything about that, Lydia?" I leaned against the doorframe, coffee cup in hand, and smiled faintly. "Maybe the system's just catching up with you," I said. She froze for a beat, reading my tone, then forced a tight laugh. Always the sarcastic one. Evan brushed past her, carrying luggage. He looked sunburned and restless. The luxury tan of guilt, I thought. Callie stayed upstairs, pretending to nap. I could hear her soft movements, the creak of her floorboards above me. Evelyn entered the house, sniffed the air as if expecting decay, then exhaled. "I see you kept everything in order," she said. I replied calmly, "I am good at maintenance." She narrowed her eyes but said nothing. I asked lightly, "Where's Harold?" She waved a hand dismissively. "At the nursing home. He's too tired for travel." The explanation slipped out effortlessly, the casual cruelty of convenience. Harold had always been quiet, a man reduced to background furniture, and now even his absence served their narrative. It cemented the pattern: mother and son united, controlling everything in reach and justifying every theft as management. That night, Evelyn decided a welcome dinner was necessary to mark their return, as if this household were still their empire. She ordered me to prepare the table, her tone clipped but civil. Callie came down wearing a simple blue dress, silent, playing her part. Evelyn looked pleased, mistaking obedience for peace. Evan poured himself a drink and began talking about investments, about how smart they had been to move assets before taxes changed. "Once we transfer the last funds, Callie won't have a cent left to worry about," he said with a grin. My hands tightened on the edge of the counter. I caught Callie's reflection in the glass of the cabinet. Her eyes flicked toward me. The plan was working. I placed the recorder disguised inside a decorative candle holder onto the table. Its red light blinked once, hidden by the flicker of the chandelier. Evelyn lifted her glass. To family. Always loyal. Callie kept her gaze lowered. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence before I answered. To accountability, I said quietly. Evan laughed. "You and your bank talk," he teased. "You sound like compliance training." I let the jab slide. Evelyn turned to Callie with mock sweetness. "You should be grateful, darling. We raised you. Without us, where would you be?" The words floated heavy with entitlement. I looked directly at her. "No, you caged her." Her hand froze mid-sip, the wine trembling slightly. Evan frowned. "What is that supposed to mean?" I smiled, the kind of smile that belongs to someone holding an ace. It means gratitude and debt are not the same thing. The room went still. Callie's fork clinked softly against her plate, deliberate signaling that she was ready. Evelyn recovered first, muttering something about ungratefulness. I let her talk. The recorder caught every word, every tone dripping with the arrogance of people who think power is permanent. After dinner, Evelyn excused herself to make a call, pacing near the hallway mirror. Evan poured another drink. He talked about the market again, about how people like us need to stay ahead. The phrase "people like us" twisted in my chest. Upstairs, I heard the soft creak that meant Callie had turned on the television, the prearranged signal. I excused myself, walked calmly to the hallway, and looked toward the living room camera. Its tiny red light blinked steadily. The same camera Evelyn had planted weeks ago now stared directly at the table where the documents sat arranged like a silent jury. I could almost hear her own voice from the past, the way she used to lecture me about control, about discipline, about keeping appearances. That was the thing about control. It blinds you to the quiet rebellion already blooming under your nose. I returned to the dining table and sat down again, feeling the weight of the moment align like gears in motion. Callie descended the stairs slowly, holding a tablet close to her chest. She stopped behind my chair, silent. Evelyn re-entered the room, phone still in hand, irritation sharp on her face. "The agency canceled our return tickets," she said, as if I had not already known. "Something about fraud review. Can you believe that?" I looked at her and said evenly, "Maybe the system knows what's true before we do." Her eyes narrowed. "You always have a way of talking like you know something." I kept my voice neutral. "I do." Then I reached forward and clicked the tablet. On screen, a still frame appeared, a bank transfer summary from Whitman Holdings, LLC. The amount was large, recurring, undeniable. Evan's glass stopped mid-air. "What is that?" Callie lifted her chin but said nothing. Evelyn turned pale. I smiled faintly, pretending to scroll. Just some light accounting. I stood up and collected the dishes. Every word, every breath was recorded now. The proof was building itself while they kept talking. By the time they realized what was happening, it would be too late. The red light on the camera blinked again, rhythmic and deliberate. I felt the moment gather like a tide. This was the threshold, the last quiet before revelation. The house seemed to sense it too. The hum of the appliances slowed the air heavier. As I placed the last dish in the sink, I looked over my shoulder and saw Evelyn watching me, suspicion dawning behind her forced smile. She tried to speak, but for once there was nothing left to say that could undo what she had already done. Sunday morning arrived with an eerie stillness that made every sound in the house feel amplified. The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked, and outside the summer heat pressed against the windows. I woke before dawn, unable to sleep, the plan circling my mind like a tide that would not retreat. Callie sat at the kitchen table, already dressed her tablet in front of her eyes, calm but fierce. Today was the day we stopped being quiet. I brewed coffee, poured it into 2 mugs, and slid one toward her. She took a sip, hands steady. We did not need to rehearse. Every step had been discussed so many times it lived in muscle memory. By noon, the table in the dining room was set again, the same scene as last night, but the air was different. The tension had a pulse. Evelyn descended the stairs in her usual perfume cloud, her pearls gleaming, her smile brittle. Evan followed, wearing his casual confidence like armor. They believed the night's discomfort had passed. They had no idea they were walking into their own confession. Lunch began with small talk. Evelyn complained about the neighbors' new landscaping. Evan bragged about market gains. Callie stayed quiet, her gaze drifting between them. I let them talk until their rhythm felt natural, until they believed control had returned to them. Then I stood and walked to the television mounted on the wall. Without a word, I picked up the remote and turned it on. The first image appeared large and crisp, the transfer summary from Whitman Holdings, LLC. The room went still. The screen glowed with numbers, dates, and the familiar company name, each transaction as precise as a wound. Evan frowned. "What is this, Lydia?" Evelyn's fork hovered mid-air. I clicked again. The next image appeared the statement of Callie's trust fund, showing deductions labeled Guardian Discretionary Withdrawals. Evan's voice came from the speakers, recorded clear and confident. "Once we transfer the last funds, Callie will not have a cent left." Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth. The sound of her wine glass slipping filled the silence before it shattered against the tile. Callie stood up her chair, scraping the floor with deliberate weight. "You stole my life," she said, her voice cutting through the room. The strength in it startled even me. Evan slammed his fist on the table. "You're insane." I turned toward him, my tone calm. "No, I'm meticulous." He looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, the quiet bank officer who had finally balanced her own ledger. Callie pulled a large envelope from her folder and set it on the table. The seal was heavy, stamped with her lawyer's insignia. She pushed it across the surface toward Evelyn, who stared at it like it might explode. "This is the authorization to proceed with legal action," Callie said. "I filed it this morning." The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. Evan muttered something under his breath, then louder. "You have no proof this is illegal." I clicked the remote again. On the screen appeared the medical report from 2021, the doctor's note reading, "Patient capable of speech. Therapy discontinued by Guardian." The words glowed like a sentence. Evelyn's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her face drained of color. Outside, the faint sound of a lawnmower stopped. The neighbors must have heard the shouting. Callie's voice rose again, steady, righteous. "You took everything my father left, you turned my diagnosis into income, and you called it love." Evelyn backed against the wall, shaking her head, tears forming. Evan grabbed his phone as if to call someone, but I stepped closer and said, "You might want to save your battery. You'll need it for your lawyer." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my own phone. With 3 taps, I uploaded the screenshots and voice clips to a local community group page, Lincoln Community Watch. The caption read simply, "Ongoing investigation. Financial misconduct under guardianship." Within minutes, notifications began buzzing. The scandal spread like static. I set my phone down on the table beside my untouched plate. Callie looked at me, her expression a mix of relief and disbelief. Evelyn slumped into her chair, her composure gone. She whispered, "How could you do this to family?" I answered softly, "Family does not exploit the vulnerable." Evan stood abruptly, shouting something about betrayal, but the words dissolved in the chaos. Callie stepped forward, calm again. "I am done living in silence," she said. Her voice shook slightly but held its ground. The house itself seemed to exhale the years of deceit, unspooling into air. Through the open window came the faint murmur of neighbors gathering near the hedge. Lincoln was a small city. News traveled faster than conscience. Evelyn's phone began to buzz with notifications, each one another thread unraveling. I watched her hands tremble as she tried to turn it off. Evan paced, muttering, "This isn't real. This isn't happening." I looked at him and said, "It is happening, and it's all recorded." He stopped pacing, his face tightening as if bracing for a blow. I picked up the remote and turned off the screen. The sudden quiet was immense. For a moment, none of us spoke. Only the ticking clock marked time again, indifferent and steady. I looked at Callie and gave a small nod. It was over. The first battle, at least. She straightened her shoulders and turned toward the door. Evelyn reached out weakly as if to stop her, but Callie didn't pause. The door closed behind her with the soft finality of truth taking root. I remained in the dining room a moment longer, watching Evelyn sink into the chair, her hand pressed to her chest, as if trying to hold something still. Evan stood behind her, pale, silent. Outside, a car slowed someone, whispering near the fence. The scandal had already begun to grow its own legs. I took one last look at the scene, the broken glass, the scattered papers, the open envelope, and felt the strange peace that comes when the truth finally speaks louder than fear. Then I walked to the kitchen window, opened it to let the air in, and let the sound of whispers roll through the house like wind-cleansing dust. Would you have gone public or kept quiet? September arrived with air so crisp it felt like a reset. The leaves along O Street and Lincoln had started to bronze the courthouse, standing solemn beneath them, like a monument to overdue truth. Callie and I sat outside on the stone steps before the hearing, the early light glinting off the building's glass doors. She looked calm, older somehow, her hands folded neatly around a notebook. Eleanor Briggs, our lawyer, stood beside us reviewing documents one last time. She was the same as I remembered from years ago, precise and unflinching, the kind of woman who made the truth sound like architecture. When the bailiff opened the doors, a rush of air swept through. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of wood polish and coffee. The Whitmans sat at the opposite table. Evelyn in gray, her pearls smaller now, her posture rigid. Evan whispered something to her, his jaw tight. They both avoided looking at us. I took my seat hands clasped in my lap, heart steady but alert. Eleanor began her presentation with a calm voice that filled the room. Over the course of 8 years, she said the guardianship of Callie Whitman produced systematic withdrawals from her trust, totaling $3,004,221.37. She paused, letting the number echo. That sum represents the theft not only of money, but of autonomy, of care, of a future. Every transaction is documented, every transfer traceable to the defendants. Evan shifted in his seat. The judge, a tall man with sharp glasses, adjusted his papers. Proceed. Eleanor projected exhibits on the courtroom monitor, the transfers, the forged authorizations, the medical report. Each appeared like a frame from the story we had already lived. When the voice recording played, Evan's own words filled the room. Once we transfer the last funds, Callie will not have a cent left. He closed his eyes, face draining of color. Evelyn whispered sharply, trying to explain, but it only made her sound smaller. The judge looked unimpressed. Eleanor continued. The victim, previously silenced under the pretense of incapacity, is here today to reclaim her own voice. Callie stood, hands trembling slightly, and faced the judge. Her voice was steady. They said I was too fragile to handle my affairs, but they used my name to fund theirs. She looked toward Evelyn, who stared at the table. The silence that followed felt like a cleansing wind. Evan rose suddenly. "We can settle privately," he blurted, his tone desperate. I turned to him. "You can't settle integrity." I said the words leaving my mouth before I could think. It came out calm, almost gentle, but the impact was visible. The judge raised a brow. "Miss Hartman, I will remind you this is not a debate, though your point stands." Evelyn broke then, tears sharp and loud. "You ruined us," she shouted. The judge's gavel struck once. "No," he said evenly, "you ruined yourselves." The sound of typing filled the pause as the clerk recorded the exchange. Eleanor handed over the final piece of evidence, a printed summary from the Medical Fraud Bureau confirming their investigation findings. The judge read it silently, then leaned forward. Based on the presented documentation and testimonies, this court finds the defendants guilty of financial misconduct and guardianship abuse. All assets associated with Whitman Holdings are hereby frozen. Restitution is to be granted in full to the plaintiff's trust within 60 days. The room was silent but for the faint whir of the ceiling fan. Evan sat back, expression hollow. Evelyn covered her face with trembling hands. The hammer struck again. Court adjourned. As people stood, I caught Eleanor's eye. She nodded once, small but certain. Callie exhaled, her shoulders finally dropping. We walked out together into the courtyard. The sky was a clean September blue. Reporters from local outlets waited by the stairs. One held up a microphone. "Ms. Whitman, can you comment on today's ruling?" Callie hesitated, then said softly, "Justice doesn't shout, it speaks when the noise stops." Eleanor smiled at that. The Lincoln Herald ran the headline that evening, "Family Trust Fraud, Exposed by Loan Officer." The article's photograph showed me walking out of the courthouse beside Callie's sunlight, striking the marble columns behind us. I read it later, alone in the kitchen, the same place where all of this had begun. The story framed it simply: a woman who once managed other people's finances uncovered the deception that destroyed her own household. They quoted my single sentence from the hearing, "You can't settle integrity." I wasn't proud exactly, but I felt something close to relief. For years, I had measured worth in numbers in careful ledgers and reconciled accounts. Now, I understood that justice was a balance sheet, too, just written in people's lives instead of decimals. I set the paper aside and looked out the window. The evening sun poured across the counter, warm and quiet. Upstairs, I heard Callie talking on the phone, laughing softly. The sound was ordinary and sacred. It was what freedom sounded like. I took a slow breath and leaned back, feeling the tension leave my body for the first time in months. Everything around me looked sharper, clearer, as if the world had been waiting for this exact adjustment of light. The truth had finally been accounted for, and for once the numbers felt right. 3 months later, the echoes of the courtroom had faded into quiet consequence. Lincoln's air had cooled with autumn, the trees along the street shedding leaves in colors too bright to match the mood of the Whitman house, now boarded and silent. A foreclosure notice hung on the front door like a scarlet letter. Evan had lost his job at the brokerage 2 weeks after the verdict, when his company reviewed his financial records and found falsified statements. Evelyn faced a tax audit that had grown into a full criminal inquiry. Her once perfectly curated social circle now crossed the street to avoid her. Justice, it turned out, did not always roar. Sometimes it dismantled piece by piece until nothing of the old facade remained. Callie's restitution had arrived in full. The number $3,004,221.37 looked different when it sat in her own account, finally under her control. She did not spend it on luxury or escape. Instead, she called me one morning, her voice bright and certain. "I know what I want to do with it," she said. By November, the paperwork was signed, and the Hartman Callie Foundation officially launched. Its mission was clear: to help children and adults with autism and disabilities access therapy technology and the independence Evelyn had once stolen from her. I attended the opening event in a converted community center downtown. The room smelled faintly of fresh paint and coffee, the walls covered with artwork donated by local families. Callie stood at the podium, her speech simple but strong. "My family tried to turn silence into profit," she said now. Silence will build futures instead. The applause that followed was warm, genuine. She looked radiant in the way only people who have finally taken back their story can be. After the ceremony, she hugged me tightly. "You gave me more than money," she whispered. I smiled. "And you gave me back my voice." The foundation grew quickly, attracting attention from regional news outlets and small donors who'd followed the trial. Callie hired therapists, developers, and volunteers who believed in the mission. Watching her rebuild from ashes filled me with something rare pride untainted by resentment. Meanwhile, I made my own choice. I handed in my resignation at the bank. Years of managing other people's ethics had left me exhausted. I wanted to help people safeguard what truly mattered. Within a month, I opened my own consultancy specializing in financial recovery and fraud prevention. My first clients were single mothers and retirees who had trusted the wrong people. Every session felt like a quiet act of correction, as if each file restored balance to something the world had tilted. On a quiet Tuesday evening, I sat at my new desk reviewing documents when a headline popped up on my phone. "Evelyn Whitman under IRS investigation, assets seized." The article included a photograph of her walking out of a government building, pale and hollow-eyed. There was no satisfaction, only inevitability. Some debts collect themselves. Still, part of me wanted to mark the symmetry. I logged into the Hartman Callie Foundation's donation portal and made a contribution of $5,000. In the comment line, I wrote for those who cannot keep their hands out of trust funds. I pressed submit and felt an odd lightness. Mini Revenge number 4, clean and elegant. The next morning, Callie called laughing. "You really wrote that, didn't you?" I shrugged, though she could not see it. "Humor helps the medicine go down," I said. She laughed again, the sound pure, unguarded. It struck me how different she sounded from the girl I first met in silence. Later that week, she sent me a framed photograph from the opening event, both of us standing beside the new foundation banner. On the back, she had written in neat handwriting, "We built this from the truth." I placed it on my desk next to a small lavender plant that had survived the season change. Each time I looked at it, I remembered that justice was not about retribution, but restoration. By early December, Lincoln had entered its long, gray winter. I often drove past the old Whitman house on my way home. The windows were dark, the yard unkempt. Yet across town, the community center buzzed with activity. I visited one evening, bringing boxes of supplies. Callie introduced me to a group of volunteers working on new therapy software. They were laughing, arguing, playfully alive. I realized that what Evelyn had once weaponized as weakness, Callie's condition, my compliance, had transformed into resilience neither of them could comprehend. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we stepped outside. The lake at Holmes shimmered in the distance, its surface catching the last gold light of day. The water was calm, reflecting the orange sky. Callie stood beside me, her hands in her coat pockets, breathing in the cold air. "Do you ever think it all had to happen this way?" she asked quietly. "Maybe," I said. "Maybe some storms come only to clear what should never have been there." She nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. We stood there a while longer, saying nothing. The city lights began to flicker on behind us, small constellations of human persistence. The sound of laughter drifted from the center, soft and grounding. I felt something release inside me, a long-held breath, finally exhaled. The years of being silenced, underestimated, and used had resolved into one still point of peace. The balance sheet was even now. The truth had collected interest, and its returns were measured not in dollars, but in dignity. As we turned to leave, I glanced back at the lake one last time. The reflection of the sky shimmered across its surface, the colors deepening from gold to rose. It looked like closure. It sounded like calm. February brought a cold that settled deep into the bones of Nebraska. The lake was frozen solid, and the air outside my porch crackled with frost. I had grown to love the silence of winter, the way it made every sound deliberate. That evening, I was sitting by the fire, a cup of tea in hand, reading over the annual report for the foundation. Callie's signature was at the bottom of the page, bold and confident. We had closed our first full fiscal year, and the impact was measurable. Dozens of families had received therapy grants. Local schools had partnered with us to integrate adaptive learning programs. The world for once felt like it was spinning in the right direction. I set the paper aside and stared at the flicker of flames, letting the calm sink in. Then came the knock. It was faint at first, then louder, insistent. I wasn't expecting anyone. The neighborhood had gone quiet hours ago. I hesitated before opening the door. When I did, the sight nearly took the air from my chest. Evelyn and Evan stood there, bundled in worn coats that didn't fit their faces, pale and drawn. Evan's once perfect hair hung limp over his forehead. Evelyn's pearls were gone, replaced by a frayed scarf. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The cold air from outside mixed with the warmth from my house, a visible fog between us. Evan finally broke the silence. "We're broke, Lydia," he said, voice shaking. "Just a small loan, please." Evelyn nodded quickly beside him, eyes pleading. "We just need enough to get through this month," she said. Her hands were trembling as she held out a small box wrapped in cheap paper. It was chocolate, the kind you buy at a gas station. It's all we could afford. I looked down at the box, then back at their faces. It was a strange thing seeing arrogance replaced with desperation. I had imagined this moment once or twice, but now that it was here, it felt less like triumph and more like confirmation of what time does to deceit. I opened the door only halfway, the light from behind me framing them in a cold glow. "You taught me what money can't buy," I said quietly. "Respect." Evelyn's lips quivered. "Lydia, please, we made mistakes, but we're family." Evan's voice cracked as he added, "I lost everything, my job, my reputation. I'm trying to start over." I crossed my arms. "You should have thought about starting over before you started stealing." The silence between us was sharp. Evelyn tried to hand me the chocolate again, her gesture trembling, almost childlike. "Please take it," she whispered. "It's peace." I shook my head slowly. "Keep it. Karma doesn't take installments." For a moment, the only sound was the wind against the eaves. Evan lowered his eyes, the defeat etched into every line of his face. Evelyn wiped at her cheeks, mascara smudging. The woman who once scolded me for folding laundry wrong now stood on my porch, broken by her own ambition. I felt no hatred, no satisfaction, only the clarity that comes when a story reaches its true ending. I stepped outside, the cold biting through my sweater, and bent to the side of the door where a small dish of salt sat. It was a habit from my grandmother who believed salt cleansed bad energy. I took a handful and scattered it across the threshold. The grains hit the wooden steps like soft rain. Evelyn watched, confused. "What are you doing?" she asked weakly. I looked at her. "Closing the ledger," I said. The words hung in the air between us, simple and final. Evan tried one last time. "Lydia, please, I'll pay you back every cent." I smiled faintly. "You already have." The look on his face flickered with shame and recognition. I could see him realizing that some debts cannot be repaid with money. They are collected through consequence. I stepped back inside and gently closed the door. The sound of it shutting was soft, but it felt like a gavel striking. Through the window, I watched them stand there for a few seconds longer, Evelyn clutching the box, Evan staring at the ground. Then they turned and walked down the steps, their figures shrinking into the night. Snow began to fall, dusting their shoulders as they disappeared down the path. I stayed still, listening to the wind whistling through the trees, the faint creak of the porch, settling under the weight of what had just passed. Inside, the fire crackled again, steady, unconcerned. I walked back to the living room and sat down, the warmth wrapping around me. The house felt lighter somehow, as if it too had been holding its breath all this time. I looked toward the window. The snow outside glowed faintly in the streetlight, each flake catching the light before vanishing. The kind of silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of understanding. Some endings don't need applause, they just need truth. I reached for my cup of tea, now cool, and took a slow sip. The salt I had scattered outside gleamed faintly under the light from the porch. Beyond it, the world carried on indifferent, balanced once again. The clock ticked softly on the mantel each second, a quiet affirmation that the past had been accounted for, and that peace finally had collected its due. Spring arrived gently in Lincoln's soft rain, cleaning the streets and making the air smell new again. My house by the lake had begun to bloom small rows of lavender swaying under the morning light. I had planted them in early March, one for each year I spent trying to fix a family that could not be fixed. Now they stood tall in fragrant purple ribbons against the green. The world outside was quiet but not empty. It was a quiet built by choice. I woke early, brewed tea, and stepped out to the porch. The surface of Holmes Lake shimmered, reflecting the pastel sky. Ducks moved slowly through the water, leaving trails that broke the stillness just enough to remind me that peace was alive, not static. Inside the walls were filled with warmth, the kind that did not demand anything in return. I had learned to love that kind of stillness. Around noon, a familiar car pulled into the driveway. Callie stepped out, holding a newspaper rolled under her arm. She waved before climbing the steps, her face lit with the kind of excitement that made her look younger. I made tea for us both, and we sat outside the breeze carrying the scent of lavender and lake air. She placed the newspaper between us, smiling. "Read the headline," she said. I unrolled it carefully. The Lincoln Herald had printed in bold letters, "Hartman Callie Foundation reaches $3 million in community funding." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The photograph beneath showed a group of children in therapy sessions, their faces focused and free. Callie's name was there right beside mine, not as a victim, but as a founder. I looked up at her, my chest tightening with pride. "You did this," I said. She shook her head. "We did." I handed the paper back, tracing the edges of the page with my thumb. There was no revenge left to want, no bitterness left to feed. It had all burned off, leaving only something clean behind. I leaned back in my chair and watched the lake shift under the light. "Karma doesn't need witnesses," I said softly, "just proof." Callie smiled, nodding as if she already knew. She took a sip of tea and looked toward the horizon. "Do you ever miss them?" she asked quietly. The question hung there like a slow ripple. I thought about it, really thought about it. "I miss the idea of them," I said. "The version that could have been kind, but missing someone is different from wanting them back." Callie nodded slowly. "I understand that now." We sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that holds meaning instead of emptiness. The wind brushed through the lavender, the sound faint but rhythmic, almost like breathing. I looked at Callie again, seeing how far she had come from the girl who once hid behind silence. "You know, I said people will read that article and think this is where the story ends." She tilted her head. "And it isn't right." "No," I said. "Justice is never a finish line. It's a way of walking." She smiled at that, and I could tell she would carry it with her. Later, after she left, I stayed on the porch, watching the sun lower itself toward the horizon. The lake turned molten gold, the air humming with insects and faint laughter from across the water. I thought about the last year, about how much had been stripped away and how much had grown in its place. The woman who once begged for approval had learned that respect cannot be given by those who have none to offer. It must be reclaimed, earned within. My phone buzzed with a new message, a photo from Callie at the foundation. It showed a child painting his hands covered in color. The caption read, "First day of art therapy." I smiled, saving the image. That was what legacy looked like, not wealth, not revenge, but restoration. I poured another cup of tea and wrapped my hands around it, the heat steady and grounding. The evening light stretched long across the porch, touching everything it could before fading. In that glow, even the scars of the past looked softened, almost necessary. I thought of Evelyn and Evan somewhere out there, probably still blaming fate, never realizing that karma had only returned what they had sent out. I did not wish them harm. I did not wish them anything at all. Some stories did not need sequels. Some needed silence. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of lavender again stronger now. I closed my eyes and breathed it in, feeling something like gratitude. Life had not been fair, but it had been honest in the end. The proof was here, in the stillness, in the peace I had built with my own hands. When I opened my eyes, the sun had slipped halfway behind the trees, its last light scattered across the lake like gold dust. I lifted my cup in a small toast to no one and whispered to the air, "Here's to quiet justice and loud peace." The reflection shimmered once before dissolving into dusk. If you believe in quiet justice, silent revenge, emotional resilience, dignity over money and truth and closure, subscribe for more stories of reclaiming respect, standing up for yourself, and justice without hate.